What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we'll talk about optimizing motor learning. Let's get it popping. So start off is, what is motor learning there? And let's use this example kind of help us try to define what motor learning is. So let's say we got a tennis player and a coach is working with that tennis player to work on their serve. Okay, to start a practice, the player can only make 50% of their first serves, meaning only 50% of their first serves are going to be accurate and going to hit inside the court there. Okay. They work for a couple hours working on their serving technique, but at the end of the session, that player is now making 70% of their first serves. So looks like there's a 20% improvement in first serves there. Question is, has motor learning actually occurred? Okay, and the answer is maybe. So, and why the answer is only maybe is that improved performance is only an indication that motor learning may have occurred. Okay, so it may have occurred, but it might not have actually been maintained there for more of a long-term change there. Okay, so what motor learning is essentially it's a set of processes associated with practice or experience leading to, and here's the important part, relatively permanent gains in the capability for that skilled performance. So basically, what motor learning is that the improvements have to be relatively permanent in nature there. Here are 4 characteristics of a motor learning definition there, and these are something that I would mark down somewhere in my notes. Okay, so first of all, motor learning is a process of acquiring the capacity for producing that particular skill there. Okay. Number 2 there, learning occurs as a direct result of practice or experience. So due to practice or experience, learning occurs. Number 3 here, motor learning cannot be observed directly. Okay? We can assume that it's occurred based on certain changes, okay, in either performance or behavior there, okay, but it cannot be observed directly. And number 4, that is, it is assumed to produce relatively permanent changes, okay, as mentioned up here in the definition, in the capability or capacity for that skilled behavior. So how do we measure motor learning there? Okay, we can try to do this, I should say there, through performance curves. Okay, and this is the most common ways of evaluating learning or progress during practice there. Okay, and we can use this to evaluate large groups of people or to evaluate the average performance of an individual. Okay, and so if we look at this chart on the right here, we look at time, okay, in seconds there, and performance on the left axis there. So over time there, performance should improve or increase. Okay. Now with this, looking at this graph here of performance there, okay, what this graph shows is that due to the law of practicing, improvements in performance there will improve rapidly at first and then much slower later on there. So as you can see, okay, early on when we start to practice something, performance will increase quite dramatically. But as we spend longer and longer time practicing, performance will continue to improve, but it will improve at a slower rate. Okay? It's one reason why, if you look at high-level track athletes there, okay, if you're trying to get better at sprinting, initially, okay, your sprinting times will drop significantly, meaning you're getting quite better quite well. But then when you get to the upper echelon, the high-level sprinters there, okay, they might train for 4 years to try to drop their, let's say, 100-meter time there by a total of a tenth of a second. Okay, tenth of a second is a pretty big improvement in sprint performance, but compared to maybe early on in their career where they might spend 4 years and they'll drop their time by 1 to 2 seconds, a tenth of a second is a much less improvement there. So again, the better skilled we get at something, the smaller our improvements will be over time there. Now, one thing to note here in this performance curve here, again, looking at performance over time there, they are not learning curves there. Because as we mentioned previously in our definition of motor learning there, is just because you look like you're getting better doesn't necessarily mean learning has actually occurred. Okay? Essentially, these are just simply a plots of performance, which is someone's external state, and not necessarily their capability of executing at a high level, which would be their internal state. So again, performance curves can give us an indication that motor learning might be happening, but it doesn't say definitively if motor learning has occurred. So with practice there, we assume that we will get better there, okay? So again, our goal of practice there is to establish some sort of learning to occur, okay? Relatively permanent changes in the capability or capacity for performance, while also being able to distinguish that from changes in performance. Okay? With practice there, okay, many practice conditions have temporary effects as well as relatively permanent effects. Okay? Here's some example of temporary effects. Okay, practice helps change our motivation. Okay, effects of practice could change our fatigue levels. Oftentimes, especially within a workout session, the more we practice something, the more fatigued we're going to get. Okay? Effects of practice always affect us in terms of encouragement as well. Okay, so if we see positive results, we are more likely to continue practicing. So here are some effects of practice there. Okay, the effects of practice, if we done consistently, lead to relatively permanent effects that may consist or persist there across many days or possibly even years if done consistently enough. Practice can lead to temporary effects that vanish within a certain amount of time or a change in conditions. Okay? Simultaneously, okay, due to effects of practice there are temporary and relatively permanent effects that can influence performance markedly, okay, across different situations and conditions. So how do we design experiments there to try to detect whether motor learning has occurred? Okay? We often do this in terms of transferred or retention designs in these experiments. Okay? So we got two different types of tests, and I would make a note of these somewhere in your notes. Okay? What a transfer test does is it looks at changes in a specific task's conditions. So for example, does shooting free throws result in shooting three-pointers better? So maybe if I test on my free throw shooting skills, okay, and I practice shooting free throws, does that lead to me actually performing better in shooting three-pointers? So that's a transfer test. So does practice in one skill, okay, lead to better performance in another skill, okay, where the conditions are changed? Second type of test design is looks at retention test, meaning that the same test is repeated after some sort of delay or period where no practice has occurred. So for example, let's say on Monday I shoot free throws and it makes 75% of my free throws. Okay? If I repeat that test on Friday, shooting free throws, will I shoot greater than 75% of my free throws? Okay? If I shoot greater than 75% of my free throws, okay, that means I performed better on my retention test, okay, compared to than I did on my original test. So whereas transfer test looks at looking at if one skill transfers to another skill, or if working on a skill in one condition transfers to another condition. What a retention test there looks at is, does the same test perform better or worse there across a period of time when you don't actually practice? So again, while these are not transfer tests and retention tests are not quite the same thing, oftentimes these terms are used synonymously, okay? And these tests are essentially a blend of the two different designs. Okay? So here's the typical transfer retention design there, okay, which we will just simplify this and call it just transfer tests for simplicity. Okay? So in these designs there, we need to allow sufficient time, or otherwise known as rest there, for the temporary effects, okay, of our practice there to dissipate or be eliminated there. Then once we give enough time in between for those temporary effects of practice to diminish, we evaluate the learning has actually occurred in a transfer test, okay, with all groups performing under ideal conditions there. Okay. And any difference observed in this transfer test, okay, we assume there to be or due to a difference in the relative permanent capability or capacity change for performance done from that earlier practice. So basically, in this transfer test, if we've gotten better there, we can assume that learning has occurred because we have given enough rest time or time in between to allow for the temporary effects of practice to be eliminated. So in these tests here, okay, there's two types of variables we might take a look at: performance variables and learning variables. And I'll make a note of these somewhere in your notes there. Okay. So what a performance variable does is it affects performance when that variable is present, but when that level is altered, okay, in the transfer test, okay, or is taken away there, the effect is altered as well. Okay? So essentially, these performance variables will influence performance, but not relatively permanently. So here's an example there. Okay, let's say I put a taped X on a backboard to help with a basketball shooter shooting a banked basketball shot. Okay, so that X right there gives them, the basketball players, a target to shoot for to bank off the backboard there. Okay, but in a game there, that X won't be there. Okay, it will be removed during the game there. Okay, so having that taped X there would be an example of a performance variable. When it's there, it helps with performance. Okay, but when it's changed there, meaning removed in this case here, the effect is altered as well. Second variable there is a learning variable. Okay, and this learning variable affects performance after the variable has been removed. Okay, and so this learning variable there would actually lead to relatively permanent influence on performance. Here's one example of that. Let's say during training there, you perform sprints with a weighted sled. So performing sprints with a weighted sled, okay, might lead to, in actual performance, in an actual race there, okay, lead to faster sprinting in actual competition where you perform it without the sled. Okay. So again, training with a weighted sled might help you accelerate faster so that in a race there you'll lead to a relatively permanent change of sprinting faster. So that would be an example, that weighted sled there would be an example of a learning variable. So when we learn something there, okay, we oftentimes look at what's called the transfer of learning. Okay, and what the transfer of learning is that practicing one particular task or skill there, okay, leads to better performance in some other task or skill. Or maybe it's the same task in some other different setting there, or it could be both. Okay, and this transfer of learning could either be positive, meaning that practicing one particular skill leads to better performance of that skill in another situation, or leads to better performance in a separate skill. Okay? So that could be either a positive performance, meaning helps you improve performance, or it could be negative, meaning that performance actually drops or decreases. And we assume that transfer of learning has occurred there when the skills in that one task there are applied successfully in the performance of some other task or version. Okay? And a good example of this is during practice, we perform different drills. For example, in soccer, you might play 3-on-3. Or maybe in soccer there, you practice dribbling around cones. Or maybe in soccer there, you practice shots on a goalie, okay, penalty shots there. And what we're assuming is that practicing these drills, okay, in practice, okay, will lead to better performance in the actual soccer game. We also can assume that transfer has occurred when skills are modified to make them easier to practice. Okay? So, for example, in gymnastics, if you practice the individual elements of the floor routine separately, okay, then put them together later on there, okay, that in turn there, when you put them together in the entire routine, that's more difficult. Okay? We assume transfers occurred when practicing the skills individually lead to better overall performance in the actual total routine. So with transfer, there's a specific transfer versus a generalized transfer. And again, I want to make a note of this somewhere in your notes there. Okay? So a specific transfer, okay, meaning that we are trying to look at the transfer of learning here, okay, at a very specific task with a very limited range of variations. This is oftentimes occurs in many closed skills. For example, okay, free throw in basketball. If you shoot a free throw in basketball, you're at the same distance from the hoop. The hoop is at the same height above the ground there. You got the same size ball there, so it's a very consistent scenario there. So therefore, in order to get good at shooting free throws, since you know you're going to have the same situation every time there, you can practice that skill of shooting free throws a lot there, okay, by shooting free throws, because we are going to assume that there's going to be very specific transfer to shooting free throws in the game, because you know it's going to be the same distance and the same height of the rim there and using the same ball there, whether you're in practice or in the game. So that would be an example of a specific transfer. practicing the exact skill that you're going to actually see in the particular competition. Now, another transfer there would be a generalized transfer. Okay, and with generalized transfer of learning there's a near transfer and far transfer. So the difference between these is that a near transfer is that where practicing transfers to different yet very similar settings. And so, for example, this would be looking at the transfer of jump shot in basketball. So a jump shot in basketball can be used from many different positions on the court there. It could be close to the basket. It could be far from the basket. You can practice with a short jump on your shot. It could be a higher jump, okay, on your shot there. So practicing a jump shot can transfer to different settings, meaning different distances from the hoop there, okay? But the settings are very similar because that ball is still the same size. The hoop there is the same distance off the ground. So that would be an example of a near transfer. Example of a far transfer is that you're developing more general skills, okay, that cover a wide area of situations there, okay, but only a few of them which are actually experienced in specific practice. So, for example, elementary physical education teachers will teach the skill of throwing, okay, and when they teach the skill of throwing as a far transfer to throwing lots of different objects, okay. So maybe you're throwing a basketball in some cases. Maybe it's a baseball. Maybe it's a frisbee. Maybe it's a baseball. Okay? Maybe it's a tennis ball. So throwing a bunch of different objects there. Okay? So a bunch of different implements there. And maybe you're throwing across a lot of different conditions. Maybe some conditions you are throwing to a target. Maybe you're throwing to a person who's standing still. Maybe you're throwing to a person on the move. Maybe you're throwing where wind is a factor. Okay? So that's an example of far transfer where you develop general skills there that apply to a wide range of different scenarios. Next up, let's look at skill acquisition, retention, and transfer. So how do we acquire skills, meaning improve skills to a greater degree so that we become more advanced in that skill? Yes, there's practice, practice, practice. In general, the more we practice there, okay, the better we are at acquiring these skills and becoming better at these particular skills. So we assume that just the more practice you put in, the better you're going to get. And this was popularized by the author Malcolm Gladwell in his book called Outliers, where in his research, okay, what he looked at here is what he found a commonality between a lot of these different skilled performers is that they spent 10,000 hours of practice become an expert in that particular skill. Now, the thing, though, is what did these 10,000 hours of practice look like? Okay, is time the biggest factor there? Okay, so just spending a lot of time practicing, is that going to make the biggest change in skill acquisition there? Okay, is all types of practice the same? Okay, and the key thing we need to note here is that not all practice is the same. And we need to look at some basic principles of practice to look at why not all practice is going to be the same quality of practice. Okay. Yes, practice is repetition, repeating stuff over and over again, but it's more than just repetition. To become skilled in something, we need to focus on deliberate practice. So again, I'll make a note somewhere is what are the key points of deliberate practice? Okay. Deliberate practice, first and foremost, there is effortful, meaning we're giving a lot of effort towards practicing this particular skill. Number two, deliberate practice should be goal-orientated, meaning we have something that we are working on. Okay, maybe it's, for example, I want to make 7 out of 10 free throws. Okay, so when I'm practicing free throws, my goal is to get to the point where I can make at least 7 out of 10 free throws. And also with a deliberate practice, not only do we have to give great effort, we have to have a goal we're focused on. We need to use feedback, okay, to try to improve performance. Okay. So again, using the example of making 7 out of 10 free throws there, okay. One example of feedback we can get is if the ball goes through the hoop there, that means I'm shooting the ball better. Okay, if the ball misses, it does not go in, that means I'm probably shooting the ball worse. What's important to know with deliberate practice is that skilled performers, okay, tend to engage in deliberate practice, okay, much more often than do less skilled performers. Okay, because I could just go through the motions, I could just put up shots there, okay, but if I give a lot of effort, I have specific goals there, and I use feedback there to try to improve my performance, okay, I will improve at a lot faster rate than someone who's not undergoing deliberate practice. Another principle of practice there is that there's a difference between learning during practice and your performance getting better during practice. Okay. The idea, okay, one quote popularized by the great Vince Lombardi, former coach of the Green Bay Packers, there is that perfect practice makes perfect. Okay. But this is not actually the case. It is actually a coaching mistake, and I would highlight this somewhere in your notes there, that encouraging only high level performance, meaning making very little to no mistakes during practice, is a good thing. Okay. So if coaches at your practice, you make the drills there and the situations that you're practicing so easy that the players there are very successful for the vast majority of the situations that you put them in practice. Yes, will their performance during practice go up? Yes. But will the learning go up during practice? Not so much. Okay. They will not actually learn and retain the skills that they've been practicing, okay, if you make things too easy for the players. Okay. What's important with practice there is we need to explore different techniques, different strategies, and different movement patterns that allow for mistakes to happen in practice. Because with mistakes, that encourages our athletes there to actually learn. Okay, encourage them to explore, to find new ways for them to actually accomplish a given task there. Okay? And one way we can evaluate, okay, how effective our drills are and practice plans are, so we can add in test sessions throughout various practices and track those test sessions over time to see if motor learning is actually occurring. So benefits of practice there, okay? Number one is effective performance, okay? The more we practice, in general, we are probably going to perform some sort of skill better on in the future, okay? But aside from just improving on performance there, okay, there are other aspects of motor learning that occur outside the motor portion, okay, that we need to take a look at with the benefits of practice. And we'll discuss these bulleted points there on future slides. Perceptual skills, attention, okay, looking at reduced capacity demands and reduced effector demands, as well as motor programs and error detection. So first, looking at perceptual skills. Let's use chess as an example. Okay? So experts and non-experts in this particular study, they looked at a chessboard. And basically, they had 5 seconds to analyze that chessboard. Okay, and in these examples that they looked at there, okay, they looked at a partial game, okay, where someone in the past had gone through like particular moves there and looked at that particular chessboard, and then they looked at, in some situations, they looked at 5 seconds at a chessboard where the actual pieces on the board were arranged randomly, sometimes in actually impossible situations that could not actually occur in the game of chess. Okay? And what they noticed here, they noticed 3 main takeaways from this particular test there, or from this particular experiment. First is that experts, when they were told to try to recreate the board, they were much better at recreating the board of the partial game situations compared to the non-experts. So the partial game situations where things actually could have occurred that way, the experts were better able to place the pieces more accurately where they actually were when they were when the result was actually hidden compared to the non-experts. However, okay, what they did notice is looking at the randomly arranged boards, the experts and the non-experts were equally as successful at recreating the boards amongst each other there. So the situations where that actually could have occurred in an actual chess game, the experts were much better at recreating those boards versus the random arrangements, both experts and non-experts performed at the same level. Okay. So one of those big outcomes for this particular study there is the capability to remember what you saw there in the past there is specific to the skills of observations and perception that have acquired over many years of practice. Because due to the experts having seen similar arrangements of the boards of partial games, okay, much more often, okay, they're used to seeing those types of boards versus randomly arranged boards, which are impossible to see, so they didn't get a lot of practice seeing those actual particular boards. So basically, expertise there is specific to the nature of the skill that has been practiced. Okay. Experts seek out more specific and narrowly focused information, okay, in a particular display and pick up on that information much earlier. Okay. Essentially, what this means is a fancy term of saying is experts, because they recognize patterns in their particular skill set there, they're able to block out the unnecessary or less important information and focus on the important information because they already or have experience with the extra information. Versus the non-experts, okay, are overwhelmed by the information because they're not used to seeing the patterns that the experts pick up on. And finally, their practice and development of skills change the way experts view the world. Okay, so with practice there and getting more skilled at something, okay, experts are able to slow things down in their minds to be able to perform better there. And this changes the task perception there because they have better handle of the particular patterns that they see. With another thing there is we're looking at attention, okay? And specifically with attention is looking at reduced capacity demands there, okay? So we know from talking about previous topics in this course here that performance suffers when the overall attention demand there exceeds our available attention capacity. Meaning if we receive too much information, okay, we can't handle taking in all that information at once, okay? But with practice there, as we become more skilled, okay, what practice does is reduces the performance decrement, okay? Meaning that if I learn a task very well there, I don't need to spend nearly as much attention on that particular skill. So less attention on a particular skill, meaning I have more attention available to focus on other things. Okay? And this diagram here to the right demonstrates this finding here. On the y-axis here, we're looking at skating time. Okay? On the bottom there, we're looking at 4 different levels of hockey players, okay? Going from very young, okay, to higher levels of hockey, okay? And in this particular study there, okay, they looked at poor skills, meaning for these particular age groups, okay, those who are very beginner level compared to those who are averagely skilled level in red there, okay? And so what they're looking at there is skating, okay, without a puck and with a puck, okay? And so what they noticed here, okay, is that skating without a puck at each age level there, okay, performance was roughly the same, meaning that they skated this particular course or whatnot there at roughly the same amount of time. However, when they skated it with a puck, you'll notice that at no matter the age level there, those who were more beginner skill level spent a lot more time skating with that puck there compared to the average skilled athletes there. Okay. And so what this shows us here is that the skill of handling the puck there, okay, it's in both groups, yes, it slowed down their skating skill, but because those of average skill, okay, are more comfortable handling the puck there, they can skate faster while handling the puck there compared to their beginner counterparts there. And that is due, again, to because they're better at handling the puck there, they don't need to spend as much attention on handling the puck, and they can spend more time onto skating faster through the course. Also with attention, okay, as we become more skilled performer there, there's reduced effector competition. Okay? As we've talked about previously, okay, interference, okay, between the two different skills, okay, arises when one effector has a movement goal or pattern that is different from the other effector. A good example of this is asking someone to rub their stomach and pat their head at the same time. Okay. So again, if you were asked to rub your head at the same time, or should say rub your head and your stomach at the same time, or pat your head and stomach at the same time, okay, that's pretty simple to do. Trouble arises though, okay, if you're asked to rub your stomach while patting your head, because that skill of rubbing and the skill of patting are two different skills that interfere with each other if you're a novice. Okay, so it's very difficult for you to execute these two different motor programs, okay, that is rubbing and patting, okay, different parts of your body at one time. However, when practice occurs, if you practice rubbing your stomach and patting your head at the same time, okay, as you do that there, okay, what happens is that skill of patting your head and rubbing your stomach, they are combined together into, instead of having two separate motor programs, those are combined into a single motor program, okay, that governs both of the actions. So with practice there, okay, we reduce that effector competition, meaning more successful, okay, rubbing your stomach and patting your head at the same time. So kind of going along with what I just mentioned in the previous slide, okay, we need to look at our different motor programs there, okay? Because as we talked about previously, motor skills there are learned through developing motor programs to govern those skills. For example, we could have a motor program of shooting a basketball. We can have a motor program there of jogging. We can have a motor program for kicking a soccer ball. A task that requires more motor programs is more difficult. Okay? So for example, if I was jogging and dribbling, the skill of dribbling is separate from the drill of jogging. So those are two separate motor programs. Okay? But again, through practice there, we can combine those separate motor programs, okay, into one larger motor program, okay, as this particular diagram gives an example of. Okay? So if we take two separate motor programs and combine them into one larger motor program through practice there, okay, that occurs there with more skilled performers. Error detection is a very important part of the learning process. Okay? Learners, okay, who can detect errors and analyze their own errors are going to typically be more skilled than those who cannot detect and analyze their own errors there. Okay? And one reason why skilled performers are able to detect these errors and be more successful there is because this error detection and correction capabilities make these more skilled performers more self-sufficient. Okay? And this is important there, okay, because if you're practicing, you might not always have a coach there to give you particular feedback. So if you can detect errors on your own, that means you can practice more often, meaning you can get better at a particular skill. Okay? And again, if you got an instructor or a coach around there, okay, having that skill to self-detect errors there, okay, won't be as important. Okay, but again, it's important for the athlete or person there to become more self-sufficient there, being able to detect particular skills on their own. So as coaches or teachers or instructors, we should teach our students or athletes there how to detect their own errors so they become self-sufficient at practicing. With detecting errors, we can detect errors from a variety of different senses. Maybe taste, touch, feel, sight, okay? Many different senses there can help us to detect errors there, okay? And just depending on our skill level or the specific tasks, some senses might be better than others there with this error detection. So going along these lines of helping our athletes or students there to be able to self-detect their own errors there and to get better there, okay, we might want to create environments that are constraint-led, okay? And this constraints-led approach there might assist with the learning process. Okay? what does constraints mean? Okay, meaning is that we got certain features, okay, or certain rules or certain guardrails or certain guidelines there, okay, that puts boundaries on our performance. And these constraints there can kind of fall into three different categories, okay? Organismic, environmental, and task. So organismic, thinking organism, meaning looking at the individual learner there, okay? What's this particular individual's body dimensions? What are their abilities? What's their mental capacities to be able to handle this particular situation? Constraints could be environmental in nature, okay? So how does gravity play a role, okay? Are we on a hardwood surface? Are we on concrete? Are we on grass? Okay, is the wind blowing? Okay, things like that. There will be some examples of different environmental constraints. And then there could be something in the more tasks constraints there. And these are very specific to the particular activity we are engaging in. Maybe the specific tools or equipments that we're using. So are they using a soccer ball or a baseball? Or maybe a bat there. Okay, those are different tools or equipments there. Or maybe specific rules there. For example, you might practice throwing, and one rule might be you have to throw with your non-dominant arm there. So different rules there might make a task more specific to a particular situation. Yeah. With motor learning there, okay, part of the learning process there is to actually do the particular movement there, okay? And to allow our students or athletes to learn, one way we might do this is through exploration, okay? So by exploring the given environment, okay, which has certain constraints on it, this can teach the particular student or athlete there to perform better in different scenarios there. And it's our goals as instructors or teachers there to meet the particular people at their organismic, environmental, and task capabilities so that they can are adequately challenged and able to see some sort of learning that has occurred. So here's one example of what a constraints-led approach might look like there. Okay, so we've got this baseball hitting group there, and they're looking at the launch angle, okay, of the swing of the particular bats there. Okay, and in this particular experiment there was three different groups there. One group was given an internal focus of attention. They were told to get your hands under the ball. Okay. The second group was given an external focus of attention, and they were focused on driving the ball over the infield. Okay. And then the third group there had a constraints-led approach there, okay, learning approach there. They were not given any particular instructions. The only instructions they were given is to try to hit over a barrier that was just past the infield. And they had 6 weeks of practice, okay, on working on their launch angle and their swing. Okay, and in this slide here, or in this diagram here, okay, these are the results there. Okay, on the x-axis here, it was the number of training sessions. Okay, training session 2 through 18, for example, there. On the y-axis is the bat path angle variability, meaning is how did the bat angle, how much of a difference did that bat angle go through? Okay, so for example here, if some line was at 1 would mean that the bat angles in their practice sessions, their average bat angle, okay, the difference in the bat angles was about 1 degree. So maybe, let's say for example, they were swinging that bat at a 60-degree angle. If there was 1 degree on average change in bat angles there, that might mean that they were swinging, or I apologize. So if they were swinging their bat at an angle of, like, say, 60 degrees, okay. So by swinging that bat angle at 60 degrees, if this was at 1 there, that means that their bat angle swinging, it would average between like 60 to 61 degrees of angle. If it was at 7 degrees, maybe that would mean that they're swinging that bat from 60 to 67 degrees of angle there. So basically what this is trying to say here is that the less the angle of variability, meaning the more consistent their swings were. Okay. And due to 6 weeks of practice, okay, this is what it looked like across the 6 weeks of practice. Okay. So what you'll notice there is the internal focus of attention. Okay, they stayed roughly similar with the same bat path angle of variability there. Okay, the group there that had an external focus attention, they had a little bit more variability. Okay, and then the red group was the constraints-led approach there, showing that they had a lot of variability. Okay, with changing their bat angle. Okay, so what this meant is that the working on launch angle, the internal focus of attention group actually had the worst results there. Okay, worst results there. Okay, and the best there was the constraints led by the time at the end of the 6 weeks of practice. So notice that the constraints led approach, okay, had the smallest variability in bat angle, which means their hits would be a lot more consistent. Okay, and not only that there though, but especially in the middle training block where there was a greater different angles of variability there, what this shows is that the batters even got better at hitting at different angles, okay, with more practice there. Okay, so not only did they perform better at the very end there, but they had more practice in different bat angles, okay, which might help them if their pitches, they had hit pitches that came in at different parts of the strike zone. Next up, let's talk about this term of motor memory. Okay, what motor memory means is the persistence, okay, or the consistency of maintaining a particular skill level, or that maintain that acquired capability for performing at a certain level. Okay, so essentially, okay, we could think of motor memory meaning the same thing as motor learning. Okay, a skill there can only be learned if that particular skill can be retained relatively permanently, okay? Meaning that we could repeat that skill, okay, after periods of not practicing, and we could still maintain that skill at a certain level there. Okay? So motor memory essentially is that capability for performance, and it's not necessarily a location where that capability is stored. So we're not thinking about it in terms of where is it stored in our brain. Instead, what we're just thinking about here is how well can we repeat that particular skill over time. So if we got motor memory there, the opposite of that would be motor forgetting. Okay, and in order to understand motor forgetting, or how much our performance may drop there when we experience periods of where we don't actually practice, is we need to understand what the retention interval that we're looking at. And what a retention interval is the period of time where no further practice is taken, okay, in which time we might forget how to perform a skill as well. Okay, so retention intervals could vary between a few seconds to a few hours to a few days, maybe a few years, okay, just depending on the study and what you're looking at. Okay. What research has shown is that some types of skills seem to persist, or we tend to remember these skills for a longer period of times, while others tend to be lost quickly. Okay? And what this diagram to the right here is looks at the acquisition and retention of a particular discrete skill over time in trials. Remember, discrete skills are typically those that are relatively shorter in nature and that have a specific start and end. And how to read this graph here is that during the acquisition trials phase, meaning that they just practice this particular skill a lot there, okay? What we got on the y-axis here is the average correct responses, okay? So the higher this value is, the more learning would have occurred. So as they get practice there, notice that the more learning, or the more responses, correct responses, have occurred, meaning that we think that motor learning has occurred. But essentially there, we've just gotten better at that particular skill. Now, after 63 trials there, okay, there was a pause there, and there was a retention interval of one or of a particular amount of time there, okay, and then they retested the skill to see how well that particular discrete skill was maintained. Okay, and this retention interval changed depending on what group the particular participant was assigned to. This retention interval varied between 1 minute to 20 minutes in blue, 2 days in green, 7 weeks in purple, and 1 year in this salmon color. So basically, okay, if you were in the 1 year group, meant that you waited a year before performing this particular discrete skill again. And what you can notice here is that the shorter the retention interval, meaning the shorter amount of time between stopping the practice and starting the test there, the shorter that interval was, the less of a drop-off we had, meaning there was less motor forgetting in the group that only waited 1 minute before retesting compared to the group that waited 2 days. Okay, so notice how performance dropped off significantly if you waited 2 days. Okay, and then even if you waited a year there, okay, they dropped off well back to baseline levels there. So essentially, what this means is for discrete skills, and I will make a note somewhere in your notes on this, the larger the retention interval, okay, the more motor forgetting that will occur. Now to the right here, okay, let's, instead of looking at discrete skills, let's look at continuous skills. So the acquisition and retention of continuous skills. So remember, continuous skill is something that's repeated over and over and over again, where there's really not a beginning and an end, particular end on that. And in this particular graph here, okay, what we're looking at is error on the left, and then we're looking at time on the x-axis. So as errors go down, that would mean that performance increases. Okay? So notice here in this particular study there, okay, there was a 9-month retention interval, there was a 12-month and a 24-month. Okay, so in this particular time there, what you know is even after 9, 12, or 24 months, the amount of motor forgetting that occurred was very minimal. Even in the 24-month group, that group still performed quite well there. Okay, so basically what this means is that discrete tasks are forgotten relatively easily, whether continuous tasks such as jogging or swimming or biking are typically retained quite well. Let's take a look at skill transfer. Okay, so what skill transfer is just that idea that is getting good at one particular skill or particular situation can be transferred to another particular skill, or maybe that same skill in a different situation there. Okay? Also, you can think of skills thought of as generalization there. Okay, so how well does getting better at one particular skill help with getting better at another skill, or getting better at a particular skill in a different situation? So a good example of this might be does practicing throwing a baseball lead to better performance when serving a tennis ball? Meaning that if you throw a baseball well, does that mean you can also serve a tennis ball well? And with skill transfer, there can be a positive transfer, meaning that getting better at one skill will get better in the other skill. Negative transfer, meaning getting better at one skill means worse performance in that second skill. Or mean zero transfer, meaning getting better in one skill does not lead to any performance improvement in the other skill. Okay. What we need to be concerned with is how to organize practice to maximize this generalization there during our practice session, so we can transfer the particular skills we practice during practice to the particular competition. Okay. So with transferring or learning from one skill to another, okay, this increases as the similarity between them increases. Okay. However, just because two or more tasks use the same elements of skill does not necessarily guarantee transfer in between other skills. So again, for example, throwing a baseball and spiking a volleyball, okay, both share a lot of similar elements. For example, we got an overhand motion, okay, arm swings through, okay, but they're not exactly the same. because we got different sized balls, okay, different particular situations, different ways we actually contact or hold the particular implement. So we need to see is there going to be actually a transfer between these similar but not perfectly similar skills. First thing we need to understand here, motor transfer, okay? How does it change as learning progresses, okay? What happens is transfer between similar skills is most applicable when just beginning to learn a skill. So what this means is if you're a beginner, okay, if you're a beginner, the more you practice throwing a baseball, okay, the better you're going to be at serving a tennis ball. So better at throwing a baseball there, the better you'll become serving at a tennis ball when you're a beginner, when you're a novice. However, at high levels of proficiency, meaning an expert there, throwing a baseball and serving a tennis ball or spiking a volleyball there, they are going to be very distinct from one another. So getting a professional baseball pitcher, getting better at throwing a baseball there, might not necessarily make or will not necessarily make him a better, let me apologize. Let me reset there. If I'm a tennis player and I'm throwing a baseball there and I'm a very high level tennis player, meaning I'm in the pros there, playing at Wimbledon, okay? If I practice throwing a baseball there, I will probably not get better at serving, okay? If I do get any better, the transfer of performance in my hitting the tennis ball will be very small due to the amount of practice I did throwing a baseball. So, in the early stages of practice, when we're beginners there, okay, transfer for our between our drills or practicing different skills to the skill of the actual competition there is going to be a major goal. But as we get better there, become more experts there, the transfer diminishes, okay? Again, as I mentioned previously, okay, a professional baseball pitcher and a professional tennis player, if they practice the opposite sport, they will not necessarily get better at their particular skill. Okay? So basically, because there's not a lot of transfer there, they should probably not spend time practicing on that other skill. So a professional tennis player should not devote like much time, if any, towards throwing a baseball. And likewise, a baseball pitcher should not devote should devote very little time, if any, to actually serving a tennis ball. Okay? And in fact, there, the time we spent working on a transfer task will take away from working on the actual skill. So if I have let's say I have a 1 hour practice session and I'm a baseball pitcher. If I spend 15 minutes of that practice session there hitting a tennis ball, that means I have 15 fewer minutes to spend actually throwing the baseball, which I would need there for my particular sport. Okay. So again, because especially since time is a valuable commodity, we want to spend time on working on skills in practice, okay, that will lead to the greatest transfer to our particular event there during competition. Next up, let's look at transferring part practice to whole practice. Okay, so a quick review there. What is part practice to whole practice? So part practice would mean breaking down a particular skill, okay, and into its individual parts there, and then together later on putting the individual parts together to the whole performance. Okay, that would be looking at part practice and transferring that to whole practice. An example of that would be a gymnastics routine. Okay? So gymnastics routine might use, let's say, somersaulting, cartwheels, okay, running, round-offs there, flips, twists, okay, variety of different skills there in their particular routine there. So they might practice their flips, their somersaults, their cartwheels, and whatnot there separately on their own there, and then later on put them together into their entire routine. So the parts practice would be each of those individual events, the cartwheel, the somersault, the twists, the flips, and then the whole performance would be that entire routine. And so we need to figure out there, as coaches there, is when will part practice lead to actually better whole performance in the actual competition, and when will it not be actually beneficial? And this depends on the nature of the particular skill that we are practicing, trying to break down to part practice compared to whole practice. So first of all, let's look at serial skills of long duration. Okay, so remember, serial skills are different skills or different sets of discrete skills that are performed one right after the other. So for example, a gymnastics floor routine would be this. Again, maybe combining a somersault with a cartwheel, with a jump, with a flip, okay, with a landing there. So those are a bunch of separate skills there, discrete skills combined together to create serial skills. And in case of serial skills, okay, of relatively longer duration there, part practice, okay, works best, okay, when the serial tasks are very of long duration, okay, and specifically when you transition from one serial skill to another, okay, the action or errors of one part do not affect the actions on the next part. Okay, so basically, for example, if doing that cartwheel, okay, does not affect the resulting somersault, which does not affect the next jump, which does not affect the next flip there, if there are like specific pauses in the routine before you perform that next skill, that's where part practice, practicing individual parts and then combining to whole there, would be more beneficial there. However, there, okay, if the serial skills have parts which influence the subsequent skills there, then whole practice is going to be necessary. So if your cartwheel immediately goes into a somersault, which immediately goes into a jump, which immediately goes into a flip, which immediately goes into a landing, okay, if that's the case there, then you're going to need to spend time practicing the whole practice or the whole routine, and you can't just do the individual part practice and expect to see better performance. Next up, let's look at discrete skills. Remember, discrete skills mean short, relatively quick in nature. Okay. What we notice with discrete skills, okay, as we break down a skill more and more and more, okay, it starts to break up this whole skill, okay, into parts that are not exactly beneficial for a particular performance there. So for example, this, okay, if I'm focused on throwing a baseball, we could break down that particular skill of throwing a baseball to the very minute part of how do our individual knuckles flex when we throw that baseball, okay? If we try to break it down and focus on those each individual parts there, okay, what this could do, okay, is that it could disrupt the throwing motion of your elbow, of your wrist, of your shoulder, of your lower body there, because you're trying to focus on these very, very small, minute, discrete parts there, and which might end up throwing off your entire throwing motion as a whole, okay? So focusing on just flexing each individual knuckle there, if I really want to improve my throwing performance, might not be beneficial there. Okay? And this partially is due to specifically discrete skills that are very rapid or ballistic, okay? They interact very well, or they affect each other quite significantly, okay? So therefore, if I'm trying to focus on each individual part there in movements that are very explosive and quick in nature, the transfer of practicing each of those individual parts separately and bringing them together as a whole the transfer is probably going to be negative in nature, meaning it could actually hinder our performance. Okay. So if we're trying to focus on discrete skill improvement there, it is best to focus on whole practice instead of part practice. So in summary there, I would make a note of this somewhere in your notes there. Okay. For very slow serial tasks where the individual components don't interact with each other, part practice is going to be very efficient. For example, an obstacle course. For very brief programmed actions, okay, practice on the parts in isolation are not going to be useful and could in fact lead to worse performance or worse performance in the long run, meaning a decrement in motor learning. For example, a vertical jump or throwing a baseball. And in summary there, the more the components of an individual task there interact with each other, the less effective that part practice will be to the whole part. Next section here, let's take a look at practice. Okay, so how do we look at practice there? Okay, and one part of practice is motivation. Okay, motivation, okay, is seen to have an indirect, or it used to be seen that motivation would only have an indirect effect on motor learning. Okay, but through more research there, it's been shown that more motivated learners, okay, will give better effort to a particular task. Okay, will oftentimes be engaged and focused and spend longer periods of time practicing, which in fact there will lead to more effective learning. So basically, a more motivated person will experience greater learning outcomes than someone who is not motivated. And these 6 different factors affecting motivation in the bottom of the slide here will be discussed on the next several slides in this presentation. So first, goal setting. Okay, so goal setting is important because it provides some sort of organizational structure for practice, as well as some sort of motivation or a goal to try to work towards. Okay? And on this diagram on the right here, it looks at target shooting practice. Okay, with the y-axis there, okay, meaning the higher up in the y-axis mean the more accurate you are. Okay, and on the x-axis here, okay, we're looking at the sessions practicing, and then we're looking at a retention test, okay, later on there. Okay, and in this particular study, the participants were split into 3 different groups. Okay, there were goals that the participants set for themselves. There were goals that the experimenter set for the particular participants, and then there was one group that was just told, do your best, where no particular specific goals were given. So what was noticed there, okay, across the different practice sessions, not only did the experimenter and participant goals, okay, they got much better, or their performance improved much better across the trials than did the do your best goals. Okay, when they looked at how well did these skills retain, or how well did motor learning occur when the retention test was performed later on, both the experimenter and participant set goals did a lot better than the do your best goals. Okay, so basically what this is showing here is that having very specific goals, whether led by the experimenter or the participant, okay, is going to lead to better motor learning there than not having goals set at all. Another thing helps with motivation is self-efficacy. And what self-efficacy is, the definition, is that the belief you have that you can be successful at doing something. Okay? And so essentially what this means is that the more confident you feel in performing some sort of activity, the more likelihood is you will actually perform that activity. So if you feel confident, for example, playing basketball, it's more likely that you will actually spend your free time playing basketball. Here are a couple different ways that you can increase someone's self-efficacy. Number 1 is performance attainment, or maybe success in performance. And this has been shown to be the most effective method of improving self-efficacy. Okay? And this is why it's very important, especially in the early stages as someone starts learning a new skill there, is to show that particular participant early success. So by showing, for example, if someone's practicing free throws, if you can show throughout a practice session, hey, at the beginning of the practice session, you're only making 50% of your free throws. By the end of the practice session, you're now making 70% of your free throws. Okay? If you can show that person that they got better across the practice session, that person's more likely to, a couple days later, to practice their free throws again, and then practice their free throws again, practice their free throws again, because their self-efficacy has increased due to seeing that success. Another way we can increase self-efficacy is through vicarious experiences. Okay? So basically, if we see, for example, professional athletes or people maybe from our hometown or people that we know that are having success performing a particular skill or whatnot, that might give us the confidence and increase our self-efficacy enough for us to practice that particular skill, to get better at that particular skill, because we can see that other people have done it before. A good example of this is the 4-minute mile barrier. So in the olden days there, it was thought that no one could run a mile in 4 minutes. People gotten close, but nobody was able to ever break that barrier. And then one year, Roger Bannister broke that 4-minute mile barrier, running it under 4 minutes. Funny thing is, the next few years there, several other people managed to run the mile in under 4 minutes. Okay? So basically, nothing really changed much. It's not like training methods changed a whole lot in those few years, but basically just by someone setting the new standard there, it gave the other people confidence or the self-efficacy to say, hey, I could actually accomplish that goal, leading to better performance from those people. Third thing that can affect motivation is how difficult do you perceive the task. And with this task difficulty perception there, okay, we want to create situations for particular students or athletes, okay, that are challenging enough so that we can, our participants will be motivated to try to achieve this task. Okay, something that's too hard there, okay, would lead to discouragement. So you don't want to make the skills or tasks too difficult for our people that we're coaching or teaching to achieve. But we don't want to make them too easy either, because if it's too easy, they're probably going to be bored there, and motivation will also be reduced. Okay. One way we can, aside from just structuring the activities to make them challenging enough but not too challenging, is we can change basically our students or our athletes' perceptions of the particular drill or skill that we're going to work on, change their perception of how difficult the task is to help them think that it's going to be that's going to make it easy enough for them to complete that task. One example is that in one particular study, they created some optical illusions to try to improve putting performance. Okay, and what was shown there is the participants who performed with these optical illusions there, they both maintained improvement in both retention and in transfer tests. So essentially, putted better with these optical illusions that were geared towards helping them putt better. And another example there, okay, in another study, participants were told that people like yourself, okay, with your experience level, usually perform well in this particular task. And when they were given this information, okay, these participants did much better on the task there compared to the control group who was not told anything. So again, if you tell your students or athletes that other people, or you can show them that other people with similar ability levels have been successful in that particular task, they are more likely to be more motivated and perform better in that particular task. Another thing to help with motivation is the learnability of a task. Okay? So whether learners view the ability to have success at a task, if you view this idea of being able to learn either as a fixed capacity, meaning that we only can learn so much, or if we believe that the ability to learn is just due to how much practice we have, both have been shown to affect both the motivation and motor performance and learning for particular people. Okay? So if learners are told that a task can be learned, okay, meaning that you can, through practice, learn how to, for example, run a mile in under 4 minutes, or you can learn how to hit a bullseye in dart throwing. Those people were shown to have greater self-efficacy, okay, have a positive effect, had greater interest in particular task, and improved across several trials. So what we need to think about as teachers or coaches is that we need to think about how do we give instructions and feedback. Oh, my apologies. Okay. So for example, this phrase here, you are a good kicker. Okay. What this does is just suggest that people have inherent ability. Okay. meaning that you're either born to be a good kicker or you're not born to be a good kicker. Okay, versus this phrase here, those kicks are very good. Okay, this phrase reflects effort or experience. Okay, meaning that you are encouraging effort and practice rather than some sort of genetic ability to perform well at a particular task. So by saying phrases like the latter here, okay, those kicks are very good, this allows for errors, okay, meaning that your students or athletes feel safer to make errors, meaning that they are going to learn more, okay, and eventually in the long run perform better. Compared to the former here, okay, people who are taught or told this a lot may become more discouraged and therefore less likely to perform better in the long run. Self-regulation also affects learning. Okay, essentially what self-regulated practice means is that it gives the learner, whether it be our students or our athletes, some sort of control there over the learning environment. And several studies have shown that when we give our students or our athletes there some control over how they learn there, they tend to perform better than if they're not given any control to do stuff. Okay. One example of this is looking at these yoked experiments. Okay, so in this particular these experiments, participants in the self-regulated group, okay, meaning that some of the participants were able to have a degree of control over their learning environment, they were paired up with participants in the control group. These participants did not have control over their learning environment. Both were given the exact same practice there, okay, but the self-regulated partners, okay, got to decide certain practice conditions. So meaning that maybe, for example, what kind of implement you're using, okay, or maybe what kind of weather you're in, or maybe what kind of, if let's say if you were putting there, okay, or what kind of size balls you had, or maybe what type of course you're going to practice on. Okay, so the self-regulated partners got to decide the practice conditions, while the control group just had to go through the conditions that the self-regulated groups decided on. Okay, and what they saw there through the practice there is that performance, or when they looked at retention of performance there, the self-regulated group, okay, performed a lot better in the retention tasks there compared to the group that did not have any control, okay, despite them undergoing the same exact practice routine. Okay, so essentially what this shows us is that giving our students or our athletes there the autonomy, okay, to have decisions on how to practice there, okay, this satisfies a basic psychological need that us humans have there, and therefore, in effect, they're influencing the quality of learning. Next thing affecting motivation there kind of goes along with what we previously talked about, is having incidental choices. Okay, due to the looking at self-regulation having more success there, okay, this would make it logical to conclude that the advantages of having some decisions versus not having any decisions at all is have some sort of advantage over having enhanced information processing. Okay, so basically having these individual incidental choices, okay, meaning that these choices do not have any direct relevance to the task, may also help us to enhance learning. So maybe if you give, for example, some people the choice on what color ball to use versus some people not have a choice of the ball to use, the people just by having a choice of the color ball to use, those people might have performed better than those who don't have the choice to choose the ball color. Because the color of the ball there, okay, is not going to affect the task one way or the other. Okay, but just by having the choice to be able to choose the ball color there, this will lead to greater performance by those who had the choice in the long run. Okay. So again, and when they looked at studies that look at incidental choices, again, having choices that don't affect the outcome versus task-related choices, which do affect how they are practicing, they have been compared to each other, and there really wasn't a difference in the results there, whether the choices were incidental or task-related. So essentially, the autonomy is the important part with this motivational process, not the particular information that was chosen or that they were able to have choices on. So when we're coaching or teaching there, okay, oftentimes we give verbal information. And verbal information is important there because it provides us given information about a particular task before we actually practice that particular task. However, more is not necessarily better when it comes to giving this verbal information, because giving too much information can hinder learning there. Okay, and also learning can sometimes be more effective when done without the awareness of particular things. Okay? So what we'll look at in the next couple of slides here is learning without knowledge, and we'll also look at learning without awareness. So first of all, learning without knowledge. Okay? On the right here is a ski simulator task. Looking at someone, okay, looking at them skiing there, okay, going back and forth, okay, across this device there is looking at mimicking skiing. Okay, one group in this particular test setting was given a tip there to help enhance their efficiency in skating or skiing back and forth. Okay, some of them were, or in this one particular group, they were told to wait until they reached the middle of this particular device before applying force. Okay, and the reason they were given this information there is that it was by doing this there, it took the energy that was stored in the particular bands that were used in this particular experiment, making them more efficient there as they skated back and forth. There was a second group that was not given any information about these particular bands in this device. What they found is the group that was not getting any information, that was not given any information, performed much better and improved a lot better than the group that was given information. Okay? So essentially, what this shows us here is that we can learn implicitly, meaning learning without being given particular feedback, versus explicit learning, meaning given actual tips or whatnot there. So we can learn without being given particular information beforehand. We can also learn without awareness. Okay, and this is important there because what it shows us here is that we can get better at a skill without being aware of particular details of a particular task. Okay, studies have been conducted in which the individual segments of this task were randomly timed, except for one segment in the task, which was always the same amount of time there. Okay, and what they showed here is that in these two different groups there, okay, the repeated segment, okay, that was repeated across this experiment showed enhanced learning, despite none of the participants reporting noticing any differences between those segments. Okay, when they were made aware of the differences, learning was actually degraded in nature. So what this shows us here is instructions are not always helpful, can actually hinder the learning process. Okay, and that would make sense there. If we're given too much information, or having information overload there, okay, by having too much information, our performance can actually decrease. It's one reason why, as teachers or coaches, we might decide to choose to only give certain information to our students and withhold some information from them so they don't have too much information to learn. Another way we can learn there is through observational learning. And what observational learning is learning from observing demonstrations or watching particular modeling occur from other people there. Okay? And learning from observation has shown to be effective, okay, with the following types of information. So observational learning is effective when you're looking at different movement strategies, okay, to perform better in a particular skill. Okay. Observational learning is typically effective when information can be modeled spatially, meaning that you can show information about this particular skill there in space. Observational learning is effective in dynamic skills, and observational learning is useful, okay, when we focus on temporal information such as timing, whether we're focused on variables that are more visual or more auditory in nature. And a couple factors in observational learning that we should focus on in the next couple slides, we'll look at model skill level and how observation is scheduled. Okay, with model skill level, okay, there's some things we need to take a look at and be focused on when we're looking at observational learning. Okay, we might assume that watching a skilled performer would be more beneficial than watching a novice. Okay, this might be the case, but a lot depends on the condition for learning the novice. Okay, so we can either focus on this particular observation there. We could either be looking at it as the right way to learn, or we could look at it from maybe the perspective is from a learning perspective. Okay, so what a learning model would be is watching a novice who's learning a task for the first time. Okay, watching a novice learn can be very effective, okay, depending on the situation if you're told that ahead of time. What's important also to know is the knowledge of results, otherwise known as KR there. Okay, so this is verbal feedback there about the success of an action with respect to whatever environmental goal is in the particular environment. Okay, so and what's important to note here is that it might not actually be, it's not exactly about the skill level of the model at all, but rather it's what type of information is being demonstrated here. Are we trying to help the person who's trying to learn there? Are we trying to help to point out the errors? Okay, or are we giving them information about, or if we're trying to look at perfect templates there? Okay, and so with that there is, if we're telling our athletes, we're trying to learn from these models here, if we learn more from observing mistakes than we do from correct performances, as long as we tell our athletes there that we are trying to point out mistakes there, okay, that in turn, okay, will help us learn more from those mistakes, okay, than we do from the correct performance. Okay, and here's an example of this. So if you take a look at this study here, we got error on the y-axis. So basically, the higher the value, the more errors are going to happen. Okay, and we got three different models. Okay, we got the correct model, which is the open circles. We've got a learning model, which people are watching, meaning a beginner is going, but there's no knowledge of results. Okay, so no knowledge of results there, meaning that when the participants were shown the model there, they didn't know whether the results were good or bad. And then we have a learning model. Okay, so again, the participants are watching a beginner, but the beginner their people who are watching the beginners are told that the person's just learning, and they're given they're told what the errors are going to be. Okay, when the participants there, okay, perform the study, okay, throughout the trials there, okay, when they were shown the beginner learning, okay, and were shown the mistakes there, they actually performed the best on the test there throughout their learning trials and retained that knowledge and through different stuff, and was transfer that knowledge a lot better, making fewer errors compared to observing the correct model. And then also compared to the worst success was those who were watching the learning model but were not told what errors they were making. So essentially there, okay, the main takeaways are going to be that it's important that we're told that if we're watching someone, we're told that the person's doing it well or if they're doing it poorly. And if we're telling them that the model is performing it poorly, we need to point out the errors so that our students and athletes can learn from that model. Another thing we need to focus on with our observations is to schedule our observations. Okay, the most successful strategy in the use of models there is that is likely to be intersperse the demonstrated information with physical practice trials. Essentially, what this means here is that we need to mix up okay? Give some information, okay? Then they need to practice the skill, okay? Then we need to give some feedback or give them some more models to take a look at. Then they need to practice. Give some more information and practice, okay? Studies have shown that if we intersperse our feedback there and our directions with practice there, there's better learning, both in retention and transfer tasks, okay, compared to giving all the information at the very beginning and then just have them practice all at the end there. So basically, giving feedback and giving and observing stuff, if we intersperse it in between our practice trials, that's better than doing all the teaching and looking at models and observing at the beginning and then practicing at the end. Something else that can help us with learning and practice is mental practice. Okay? And the question is, can mental practice, so visualizing the particular skill or task and running through it in your mind, can this, just practicing mental practice alone, can this actually contribute to motor learning? Okay? The answer is yes. So with mental practice, you can get better at a particular skill. Now, it's not as good as actually practicing the particular physical skill, okay? But it's clearly better than not doing anything at all. Let's take a look at this chart on the right here. So they looked at a particular pegboard route, okay? Pegboards is essentially kind of looks like rock climbing where you've got these two wooden dowels there and you got to insert them in different slots and navigate through this course while you're hanging in the air. And there are two different tasks there, okay? A pegboard insertion task and there's pursuit rotor task, okay? And participants were split up into three different groups there, okay? There's a group that just did physical practicing, one group that just visualized their performance but did not actually go through the particular course, and then there was another group that did not practice at all there, okay? And so in both cases there, okay, the higher the value there, the better the performance is going to be. And so what you can notice here, the group that did not practice, okay, from the pre-test to the post-test, got a little better, but not nearly as better as those who went through the skills just mentally, and compared to the group that just did the physical performance as well. So mental practice does work, just not as good as physical practice by itself. Okay. So what this begs the question there is that is mental practicing just focusing on the cognitive elements? And it certainly could be. Maybe mental practice is just improving the cognitive part there of the learning process of the particular skill. Okay. But as you can see here, okay, as you learn the skills more and more there, they're still able to physically go through the course more effectively there with the mental practice, okay? So learning still seems to have occurred there, okay, even with just doing the mental practice. So how should practice be scheduled there to maximize learning on a given task? So when we're practicing, or we're creating our practice schedules and figuring out how much rest time between our different practice trials, okay, we need to consider how many days per week that we're going to be practicing, how many sessions in a day, how many hours in each session, okay, and how large of rest intervals do we need between the trials or sessions there. Okay. Question is, do different distributions of practice, okay, work differently depending on the different type of skill? Looking at discrete versus continuous skill. And it's important to note here is that what we're discussing here is not the same thing as work to rest ratios for physiological training, which has to do with energy systems. So I'm not looking at giving complete rest to improve our phosphocreatine energy system, or looking at having shorter rest periods to work on the aerobic energy system. Okay? We're not focused on that there. We're looking at rest periods specifically with learning and retaining a particular skill, okay, over time. So in general, I would make a note this somewhere there, okay? Shorter practices done more often are better than longer practices performed less often. So for example, if you practice 1 hour a day for 5 days a week, that's better than practicing 5 hours in a day only one time per week. Okay? Now, is this always practical in the real world? Not always the case, because schedules of life there can interfere with our practice schedule. Things like school, things like work, things like family time, things like social outlets, things like errands to run, things along those lines. So due to schedules here, you might be limited in how you organize your practice schedules across the week there, but we should, again, note here, in general, if we can have shorter practice sessions and do them more often, skill, motor learning, motor transfer will typically be more effective. So how can we create this distribution of practice? Okay, we got this term massed practice. Okay, what massed practice is work periods that are close together, okay, with very little or no basically rest period between periods of work. Okay, so for example, I might spend 30 minutes shooting jump shots. Okay, that would be an example of massed practice, practicing everything together at one time with very little or no rest in between. We can also have distributed practice, and this is where work periods are spaced apart with longer rest intervals. So for example, in a practice session, we might spend 10 minutes shooting jump shots at the very beginning of practice. Then we'll spend some time doing some other drills. And then in the middle of practice, we'll spend another 10 minutes shooting jump shots, and then we'll work on some other skills. And at the very end of practice, we might spend the last 10 minutes of practice shooting jump shots. So distributed practice is having longer rest periods, okay, between practice sessions. Okay. Now understand, mass versus distributed, these are relative terms, meaning that you can't just say, if you work a certain number of minutes in a row there and have this amount of rest time, that would define things as mass practice or distributed practice. So they're relative in nature. Work and rest schedules have different effects on performance and learning for both discrete and continuous tasks. And in the research there, in the literature, most of the research has been done on continuous tasks when looking at distribution of practice, with just a few studies looking at discrete tasks. So let's take a look at this chart here. And this chart here will be summarized by our findings in the next slide there. Okay. But we're looking at percentage of time on target, meaning the higher the number value is, okay, the better the performance. Okay. And we're looking at different acquisition trials there, and we're looking at a retention task. And the different trials we're looking at in this particular task there, 0 seconds of rest, okay, between trials there, 15 seconds of rest between trials, 30 seconds rest, 45 seconds rest, and 60 seconds of rest. Okay. So what you can notice right here is that the longer the rest period between the trials, okay, the greater the performance in the long run, and the better retention of performance, okay, when we retain that over a period of time. So essentially, longer the rest period, the better the skill acquisition, the faster we acquire the skill, and the better that skill is retained there in the long run. So for continuous tasks here, continuous tasks, which we're going to refer to that slide on the previous, or to our previous slide there, okay? So again, most research has involved continuous skills, okay? And due to the continuous nature of skills there, fatigue is going to build up in continuous skills there, okay? So decreasing rest intervals can have a large effect there on the learning process. So looking at our conclusions from the previous slide, again, I want to make a note somewhere in your notes on these conclusions there. So typically, the first big conclusion, the longer the rest periods between the trials, in general, led to better performance. Okay? Meaning that larger time between the distribution of practice, okay, led to a greater performance effect. Okay. Number 2 here, there's a positive effect of longer rest intervals on performance had a larger, better benefit on retention tests, okay? Meaning that there was a learning effect if you had longer periods of rest. Okay? And 3 there, the size of the differences between the groups is generally reduced after a retention interval, okay? Meaning that the magnitude of the learning effect is generally smaller than the magnitude of the performance effect. meaning that in the retention tasks there, the differences between the groups there tended to be smaller there compared to when they were learning across the several different trials. Those gaps tend to be greater. Looking at effectiveness and efficiency, okay? Longer rest periods, okay, going back to that that graph there a couple slides ago, have positive effects on both performance and learning, okay? Now, nice thing is, again, so performance and learning enhanced with greater rest periods. However, that's not efficient, because if we rest longer, that means we have to spend longer time practicing overall, versus shorter rest periods means we can get done with our practice session faster. Okay, so again, due to the economics of the situation, okay, whether it's the amount of time, whether it's the amount of money you can devote to certain things, okay, you might need to condense situations there so that your practice sessions are shorter, which means your rest times are shorter, which means you might not learn as much, but that's just what your schedule allows. So just due to life in general there, our schedules might have to reduce the rest time. And in turn there, we have to just understand that learning might not be as effective due to the decrease in rest time. Okay. Now, how can we enhance this though? Okay. So one way we could enhance this though is during our rest periods, we could undergo mental practice and we could incorporate observation into these rest periods. So for example, okay, if I'm shooting free throws there, okay, and let's say I'm taking a break from shooting free throws, instead of me just taking a break and letting my mind wander there, if I visualize shooting free throws during my rest period, okay, or if I watch somebody else shooting free throws during my rest period, that in turn might lead to I might be able to get more learning done in my practice session versus just spacing out and just resting just to rest there in my practice session. Okay. Also, okay, during these rest periods, this is a perfect time to work on getting feedback from the knowledge of our results there, whether by giving our coach giving feedback there or by us reflecting on how well we did and therefore changing what we need to do the next time to improve on our performance. So now, unlike continuous tasks, okay, discrete tasks oftentimes are so short in duration there that fatigue within a trial is not going to be an issue there. Okay, so because fatigue is not an issue, there's a diminished need for needing rest intervals. So therefore, using massed practice can be more effective in discrete tasks versus continuous tasks. Okay, there is some research out there that has showed massed practicing to produce better results with discrete tasks. However, some research debunks that there and has shown benefits of distributing the practice, meaning give some feedback, practice, give some feedback, practice, give some feedback, practice. So our conclusion. So unlike with continuous tasks, which shown that greater rest time led to better performance, for discrete tasks, there's no current evidence that shows that reducing the rest time through mass practice affects learning in the discrete tasks. Another thing we need to take a look at when structuring our practice sessions is looking at constant versus variable practice. Okay, what constant practice is, and I want to make a note of this somewhere and compare it to variable practice, is a practice when only a single variation of a given class of tasks is experienced, basically meaning one particular skill in one particular scenario there. Okay. Now, with constant practice, this is going to typically outperform variable practice during the acquisition phase. So basically going from being a beginner there to maybe like an intermediate. So as you first start learning a task there, it's better to do constant practice than variable practice. So for example, just shooting free throws. If I want to get better at shooting, okay, if I just shot free throws, okay, by massing the practice by just shooting free throws there, okay, I'd become a lot better at shooting free throws there compared to somebody who was, let's say they were shooting free throws, but then they would shoot some three-pointers, then they would shoot some mid-range jumpers, then they might shoot some layups there, okay? So by just shooting free throws there, okay, constant practice, focus on one thing at a time, getting better at that, that's going to help, especially for beginners there as they're just learning a skill for the first time. Now, what variable practice is unlike constant practice, where only a single variation of a particular task is given. This is where we have many different variations of a particular skill is given. Okay, and this variable practice is going to be much better, okay, in both retention and transfer, okay, tasks, okay, which means better learning will happen in the long run. Okay. This helps especially with generalizability, meaning that we can apply learning a skill here to a variety of different situations or scenarios. So for example, if in my practice session I shoot some free throws, then I shoot some three-pointers, then I shoot some mid-range jumpers, then I shoot some shoot some layups there. Those, by having variable practice, I will get better at learning how to shoot overall in a variety of situations. And if I would stop practicing for a while, let's say a few weeks, and then come back to shooting, I would maintain the skill of shooting a lot better than somebody did that just performed constant practice. So in summary there, constant practice is great for beginners that are trying to learn one particular skill in one particular situation. Versus variable practice is much better for overall learning and learning a particular skill to a variety of different situations in the long run. It's kind of along the similar line there, we've got the idea of blocked and random practice. Okay, so in a practice session, for example, basketball coach, okay, you got to get better at a lot of different things. Players got to learn how to shoot. They got to learn how to dribble. They got to learn how to play defense. They got to learn the offense. They got to learn the defense. Okay, they got to learn how to communicate with their teammates there. Okay, so there's a lot of different skills that we need to learn to be good, learn to be a good basketball player. So how do we sequence our practice session? How do we organize it with all these different skills and tasks that we want to learn in order to maximize learning? Okay, we could do it through blocked or repetitive practice, which just means that a skill is repeated over and over with minimal interruption by other activities. So for example, we might spend first 10 minutes of practice by just shooting free throws. Then the next 10 minutes we would just shoot three-pointers. Then the next 10 minutes we just shoot mid-range jumpers there. Okay. Now compare block practice, where we have specific blocks of time focused on one particular skill there. Okay. Random practice means we intermix things, okay, within the same chunk of time. Okay. So basically, the key thing of this is that we're going to rarely or never practice the same particular task on 2 consecutive attempts. So for example, my apologies, is in the 30-minute chunk of time, we might shoot one mid-range jumper. Then we shoot one three-pointer. Then we shoot one mid-range jumper. Then we shoot one free throw. Then shoot one three-pointer. Basically, essentially taking a different shot every single time. Okay. Common sense would make you seem to think that with blocked repetitive practice, okay, would be better there for learning there than would random practice be. Okay, because random practice is going to have high variability and interference, which would seem to disrupt learning. But is it really? Okay, so let's focus on that. It would seem to be, but let's see if the research shows that to be the case. Okay. Battig's had a couple different studies there looking at contextual interference. Okay, and so again, with contextual interference, remember that learning in one task, okay, will affect learning in a different task there. And looked at a couple different studies there. Okay, so with this contextual interference there's 2 important sources of interference that could arise during practice. Okay, one source of interference could be the order in which multiple tasks are studied or practiced. Okay, if we're focused on only one task, there's low interference. Okay, but if we switch between multiple tasks, there's going to be high interference, and that would make sense there. Number 2, though, would be the nature of the material being practiced. If we're practicing similar items, okay, there would be high interference between that, okay, due to the increased confusion about them. An example that might be say I'm learning how to throw a baseball and I'm learning to throw or learning how to hit a tennis ball with a tennis racket. Those would be high interference because those are two similar skills. So by practicing one, then the other there, okay, though there will be a high interference between those two skills, okay? But if you have different items, there will be low interference. For example, throwing a baseball and kicking a soccer ball, there's very little similarities between those skills. So there would be probably low interference between learning each of those skills one after the other in a practice session. So the presence of these two sources there, okay, the order and the nature of the material being practiced, okay, both of them degrade performance and acquisition there. So the second task there, okay, would probably be hurt in performance and learning there. And in this one here, just learning both tasks would probably be hurt in general. Okay. The presence of the two sources there also facilitated performance, retention, transfer, or both. Okay. So essentially meaning that as we're going through the trials during the practice session, okay, performance was not as good in each of the different tasks there. Okay. However, there was better performance in retention, transfer, or both tasks. Okay. Shane Morgan there had an experiment looking at 3 different tasks, and in the 2 groups, they had blocked or random practice there. Block practice meaning completing all of A before B, and then all of B before C. Random means that you performed one trial of A, then one trial of C, then maybe one trial of B, basically mixing up the tasks there. Okay. In both groups, they got the same volume of work in all 3 tasks, only the order was changed. Retention test in this experiment there was performed at 10 minutes and 10 days after. Okay. Retention tests were performed in both the random and block conditions, and in the 4 subgroups there was the first initial trial was the acquisition trial, and the second is the retention condition. So this diagram on the right here, okay, basically highlights the results. So the acquisitions results, or the first part of this chart, okay, what this showed here is within the session there, as you were learning the skills, there's clearly a benefit, clearly a performance benefit for the blocked practice group. So within that one single practice session, blocked practice, okay, was much better, or was better there than random practice. Okay. But as we know there, just because performance improves within the practice session doesn't mean we retain what we learned there in the practice session to future sessions. Okay. What the retention results showed is that the random group had better performance in both the blocked and random retention tests. Okay. But the difference was much greater when the retention test was random. Okay. So basically what this means, and this is the highlighted point, and this is what I would emphasize in your notes there, is that random practice conditions are going to be more effective in retention of a skill, okay, meaning learning. So basically random practice will lead to better learning in the long run compared to blocked conditions when practicing. So why is random practice much better than blocked practice? Okay. So one is the elaboration hypothesis. So by frequently switching between tasks there, okay, helps our brains to separate the tasks between each other, making them separate there and more meaningful, meaning that our brain there will remember these particular tasks there as being separate tasks in the long run. Number 2 there is participants tend to relate the tasks that you're learning to concepts already in your memory. Okay. For block practice participants, you think that they would typically run the tasks automatically without much thought. So by essentially what that means is if I'm shooting free throws and I'm doing block practice, meaning I'm just shooting the free throws one after the other, I'm not actively thinking about about me shooting free throws. I'm just going through the motions, shooting those free throws. Versus if I would shoot a free throw, then shoot a jump shot, then come back to the free throw, I got to remember, go back to my memory, remember what it was like to shoot the free throw instead of just going through the actions automatically, which in the long run leads to better learning. Another hypothesis is the forgetting hypothesis. By switching between different tasks there very frequently, okay, leads to us forgetting a little bit of what we did in the previous tasks, mean that we need to, when we get back to the original task, we need to formulate a plan and try to retrieve from the memory what we do remember, okay? And by going through that process of trying to remember there, it will help cement in our memories better how we did the task previously, which in turn leads to better motor learning in the long run. Okay? And both these hypotheses, both the elaboration and forgetting hypotheses, are supported by research there. Okay? They complement each other, okay? And they explain why they're the effects of contextual interference there on learning. Here are a few additional notes on random practice. Okay? Contextual interference has demonstrable effects in non-lab tasks. Okay? So the results similar to those found in the Shea and Morgan experiment have been found in real-world tasks there. Okay? So in badminton serving, okay, baseball batting, handwriting, learning a new musical pieces, these are a few different situations where the Shea-Morgan experiment has been proven in real-world tasks. Now understand here, random practice, even though it's been shown to be more effective in the learning process, okay, in the long run there, it does have limitations. Okay? It appears that the random practice is going to be least effective when the task demands are so high that the performers have a difficult time producing even a single successful trial of the particular behavior. Okay? Meaning that if you're a beginner and you can't even hit the rim when you're shooting, or can't even hit the rim consistently when you're shooting free throws, okay? You're a beginner when it comes to free throws. So in that case there, random practice for true beginners who are not having like barely at all any success, it's better for them to undergo, it might be beneficial for them to undergo some sort of block practicing until they start actually hitting the rim there before we start doing some random practicing when shooting. Okay? So for very difficult tasks there, so newbies who are just learning something for the first time, block practicing might be a little bit more beneficial than random practicing. In a similar vein, okay, random practicing may not work for high-level tasks, nope, that's what I mentioned there previously. I apologize. Okay. In other cases there, if a task is very difficult in nature, okay, even for expert levels, it might be better to focus on more block practicing if the task is extremely difficult, even for that more advanced athlete. That's all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day. Booyah!